Welcome to our explainer. Today we are diving into a really complex and honestly staggering paradox: how Christianity, a faith that's all about love and liberation, was used to justify the transatlantic slave trade. It's an incredible story of how the very same book was used to chain millions and also to set them free.
So, this is the big question, right? How could a religion built on concepts like love and mercy become the moral cover for centuries of some of the most brutal exploitation in human history? That is the paradox we really need to try and get our heads around.
This quote, well, it just cuts right to the heart of the whole thing. It draws a super sharp line between the sacred text itself and the actions of the people who claim to follow it. You see, the issue wasn't the book, but what people did with that book.
Okay, so let's start with the first part of this puzzle. How did this even happen? How was Christian theology deliberately twisted and reshaped to serve the massive economic machine of the slave trade? And make no mistake, this wasn't some kind of accident or misunderstanding. It was a strategy.
What pro-slavery thinkers did was create this sort of theological weapon. They did it by ripping specific passages completely out of their historical context. They took the curse of Ham and racialized it, saying it applied to all Africans. They grabbed ancient laws about servitude and pretended they applied to modern chattel slavery. And they weaponized Paul's letters to demand absolute submission.
And if you look at this, the contrast is just wow. The biblical texts were talking about ancient, non-racial systems of servitude, which were often temporary and even had some legal protections. But the weaponized interpretation, that created something totally different: a permanent, brutal system of chattel slavery based entirely on race, and then claimed it had God's stamp of approval.
You know, there's actually a term for this: theological distortion. This wasn't an honest debate over what the text meant. No, this was the intentional twisting of Scripture to create moral cover for a system of human exploitation that was making a lot of people incredibly rich.
And this wasn't just some abstract idea debated in libraries. It became a very real, very practical tool for control. On the ground in West Africa, enslaved people were taught that their suffering was God's will and that obedience was a Christian duty. At the same time, their own rich spiritual traditions were demonized as pagan to erase their culture and create dependency.
But, and this is absolutely crucial, that's not the whole story. Not by a long shot. Because the very same faith that was used to justify all this bondage also contained the seeds of its own destruction. Because at the exact same time, there was this incredibly powerful counter-narrative building up. The very same Christian ethics that were being twisted for profit were also being used to fuel one of the first great human rights movements in history: abolition. You had people like William Wilberforce in Britain and Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved man who wrote this powerful memoir. They were driven by their Christian faith. They, along with groups like the Quakers, argued with so much passion that the slave trade was a moral abomination that stood in total opposition to the teachings of Jesus.
So you had this theological battle going on, and the abolitionists fought back by going right to the core principles. They said, look, if all humans are made in God's image, then no human being can ever be property. They pointed to the book of Exodus, where kidnapping is a crime punishable by death. They championed the Bible's call for justice and mercy over that distorted demand for blind obedience.
And here's something that is so important to remember. This wasn't just a debate happening among white Europeans. Enslaved Africans themselves became the most powerful theologians of liberation. When they heard the story of Moses leading his people out of bondage in Egypt, they saw their own story. They grabbed onto Christianity and reclaimed it as a faith of survival, of resistance, and of ultimate hope.
But even after abolition was won, the damage was done. That weaponized version of Christianity left this deep, lasting wound on the African continent, a psychological and cultural legacy that people are still grappling with today.
To really get a handle on this legacy, we need to understand a key concept called religious self-alienation. Basically, it's a state where people become deeply devout in a new faith, but in doing so, they're taught to become disconnected from their own culture, to see their own history, their names, their traditions as somehow less than or even ungodly.
And a lot of this came from the missionary legacy that followed. Think about it. African names were rejected and replaced with European ones. Cultural symbols were branded as evil. Faith became all tangled up with European cultural norms. And tragically, you had many missionaries who would condemn local rituals while staying completely silent about the massive colonial violence happening all around them.
So the big question is, how do you even begin to heal a wound that deep?
Well, today, there's this vibrant, powerful movement across Africa among thinkers, artists, and theologians to reclaim that narrative, to decolonize their faith, but without abandoning it. And this isn't just talk. It's happening through some really clear, practical steps. It all starts with teaching the full, honest history. It means carefully thinking about which cultural traditions to keep, instead of just erasing everything. It involves using art, music, and film to tell new theological stories. And above all, it's this powerful insistence that any authentic faith has to be measured by its commitment to justice and human dignity.
This slide does a great job of showing how all these pieces fit together. You've got cinema being used to restore a silenced history. Literature is giving voice to new, complex identities. Theology is restoring a culturally rooted meaning, and it's all leading to an ethical faith that restores dignity. And let's be absolutely clear on this point. For most people in this movement, the goal is not to reject Christianity. The goal is to do the really hard, painstaking work of separating the core message of the faith from the colonial culture it was wrapped up in for centuries. It's really an act of purification, of getting back to the core.
And all of this brings us to one final powerful idea. The challenge for modern African Christianity isn't some simple choice between faith and heritage. The real choice, the one at the very heart of this entire story, is the choice between truth and distortion. And that's the ongoing task, isn't it, to figure out which is which. It's a challenge that continues to echo far beyond the continent, really, for anyone who holds a sacred text in their hands.